Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tochi. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. Grace woke before dawn as she always did, when the world still wore the quiet of sleep and Lagos had not yet remembered to roar. The ceiling fan hummed above her, slicing the air in slow, uneven circles. She lay still for a moment, staring at the faint outline of the curtains fluttering in the early morning breeze. Her mind was full, restless, heavy with a loneliness she could not name. She reached out instinctively, her hand brushing the cold side of the bed where Maxine should have been. That emptiness was not new. In the beginning, she used to wonder where he went at night, but now she no longer asked. The questions had become tired guests in her heart. She rose from the bed, wrapped her faded robe around her body, and walked toward the kitchen. The marble floor felt cool under her feet, and as she switched on the light, the soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound that greeted her. She moved like a ghost through her own house, fixing breakfast for a man who barely noticed her anymore. As she stirred the pot of pap, her mind drifted back to the first time she met Maxine. He had been standing outside the banking hall in Marina, tall, confident, dressed in a navy suit that fit his frame like a second skin. He had smiled at her with that kind of smile that could melt resolve. Back then, he was the kind of man who carried the sun in his pockets. Everything about him glowed with possibility. He worked in an oil firm on Victoria Island, spoke about dreams and a future filled with promise. Grace, simple and calm, had been drawn to him the way light draws a moth, slowly, irresistibly, and without caution. When he asked her to marry him, she said yes without thinking twice. Her friends envied her, her mother prayed for her, her pastor smiled and said she had found favor. In those days, love was enough. She left her job after their second child, choosing home over career because Maxine insisted he could take care of everything. It felt right at the time, a wife's duty, a mother's calling. But as the years folded into one another, the warmth began to leak out of the walls. Conversations became small, touches became rare, and laughter became a visitor that never stayed long. What was once a home became a waiting room, filled with echoes and questions that had no answers. By the time the sun began to climb over the skyline of Lekki, the children's voices had filled the house with chatter. Grace loved those moments. Their innocent noise drowned out the silence between her and Maxine. The children, a boy and a girl, were the glue holding together what had long started to fall apart. She watched as they prepared for school, her daughter tying her shoelaces while humming a gospel tune, her son asking endless questions about why clouds were white and the sky was blue. Grace smiled at them the way a tired woman smiles at light after a long night. Maxine appeared from the bedroom doorway, freshly dressed in his tailored shirt, smelling of cologne that seemed too expensive for her modest kitchen. He looked sharp, almost cinematic, the kind of man people turned to look at twice. "Morning," he said curtly, pouring himself coffee. She replied with a small nod. That was all. They no longer shared kisses, just routine greetings spoken like duties. When he drove the children to school, Grace stood by the window, watching his car disappear down the street. A deep sigh escaped her lips, the kind that came from years of pretending. The walls of the house, painted cream and gold, stood too still, as though they too held their breath. She turned back inside, picked up her phone, and scrolled through old pictures. Their wedding day, the birth of their first child, the trip to Calabar before things changed. Every image was a ghost of joy. She didn't notice the tear that rolled down her cheek until it touched her lips. Lagos was already alive outside, honking, shouting, rushing. But inside Grace's home, time stood still, suspended between what was and what could never be again. Evening brought with it the same ritual. Maxine returned from work later than usual, his shirt unbuttoned halfway, his laughter loud from the phone call he refused to end as he walked into the house. Grace was setting the table. She didn't ask who he was talking to, she knew better. He sat, ate half-heartedly, scrolled through messages, and left his plate untouched when his phone buzzed again. "Work call," he said, as though work smelled like women's perfume. Grace nodded. Her silence had become her shield. There was a time she would have cried, demanded, prayed aloud for change, but now she just watched him leave again, watched the door close, watched her reflection in the window, and wondered when her love turned to habit. The children were asleep upstairs, the TV played a soft melody, and the night felt heavy with what was unsaid. When Maxine finally returned, long after midnight, Grace pretended to be asleep. She heard the shower run, the faint hum of a song he didn't sing for her, the creak of the bed as he lay down beside her without touching her. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping on the roof like quiet applause for a drama that never ended. Grace's eyes remained open in the dark. Her mind wandered to the life she once dreamed of, the promises once whispered in hotel rooms and during morning prayers. She felt something cold settle inside her chest. Not anger, not pain, just emptiness, thick and deep. If love had a sound, it was the sound of that rain, steady, endless, and falling for nothing. Days turned into weeks, and the pattern stayed the same. Maxine's laughter, his absences, his hollow apologies, the perfume that clung to his shirts. Grace learned to wear calmness like a garment. When friends asked if she was happy, she smiled and said yes. When her mother called, she changed the topic quickly. The truth was too heavy to carry aloud. Sometimes she'd stand by the balcony, watching the neighborhood lights blink like tired stars. She would see couples holding hands on their way from church, hear music from nearby apartments, and wonder if somewhere, love still existed for people like her. On weekends, Maxine found excuses to attend work meetings that lasted until dawn. Grace pretended to believe him. She started journaling again, filling pages with thoughts she could never say. Her handwriting was steady, her words neat, but every sentence dripped with quiet pain. Maybe love dies slowly, she wrote once, not with a bang, but with silence that becomes normal. That night, she closed her diary, turned off the light, and whispered to the dark, "Maybe I am invisible." But the dark didn't answer. Only the city did, Lagos, that loud city that swallowed tears and turned them into stories no one believed. Grace didn't know it then, but that silence, that stillness, was the beginning of her transformation. A quiet rage blooming like dawn behind clouds, waiting for its day to rise. The days that followed blurred into a quiet rhythm of motion and pretending. Grace moved like a ghost through her own home, fulfilling duties that no longer had meaning but still needed to be done. Every morning she laid out breakfast for Maxine. Bread toasted just the way he liked, coffee brewed strong, 2 cubes of sugar, 1 dash of milk, and every morning he barely noticed. He would eat distractedly, eyes glued to his phone, laughter bubbling up at messages that had nothing to do with her. She didn't ask anymore. She didn't need to. Questions had become useless currency between them. The children were the only real sound left in the house, their small voices filling the hollow silence that had settled like fog. Grace often wondered when she had stopped being seen. There was a time when Maxine looked at her and smiled with a warmth that made the world feel safe. Now his eyes slid past her as if she were a shadow. One evening, as she ironed his shirt, she noticed the faint scent of a perfume she didn't own. She pressed the iron down too hard, the hiss of steam masking the sharp sting in her chest. That night, when he came home late and mumbled something about a work dinner, she didn't bother to respond. Her silence was not surrender. It was a kind of strength. The strength that comes from knowing you no longer owe explanations to someone who has stopped listening. Sunday mornings used to be sacred in their home, but even that had changed. They would wake early, get the children dressed, and head to church as a family, Grace's hand in Maxine's, their laughter blending with the radio hymns. But now Maxine always had excuses, meetings, deadlines, sudden fatigue. Grace went alone with the children, sitting through sermons about love and forgiveness that once comforted her, but now felt heavy and distant. After service, church members would greet her warmly, their voices coated in polite curiosity. "How is your husband?" they asked, and she would smile, that practiced smile that never reached her eyes. "He's fine," she'd say, even when she knew he wasn't home. One particular Sunday, after returning from church, she walked into the house to find his shoes missing, his cologne lingering faintly in the air. He had gone out again, leaving only silence behind. She walked into the kitchen, sat at the table, and let the sunlight spill across her face. The light was soft but felt foreign, as if it no longer belonged to her world. She whispered a short prayer under her breath, not for her marriage, not even for him, but for clarity. She needed to understand how love could transform from warmth to frost without warning. Somewhere in her heart, a quiet decision was forming, though she couldn't name it yet. She was still the same Grace, gentle, dutiful, forgiving, but something deep inside her was shifting, slow and unstoppable. The following week, Maxine came home one evening in unusually high spirits. He carried shopping bags, expensive ones from boutiques she'd only seen in magazines. "Got you something," he said, dropping the bags on the couch. Grace raised an eyebrow, unsure whether to smile or sigh. Inside the bags were designer clothes, bright, glamorous, not her style. "You deserve nice things," he said, but his tone carried guilt more than affection. She thanked him quietly, knowing full well that guilt was not love. Later that night, as he showered, she sat by the bed, staring at the dresses laid out on the chair. They looked like costumes for someone else's life. She folded them neatly, and placed them back in their boxes. When he came out, towel around his waist, she simply asked, "Who are you trying to convince, Maxine? Me or yourself?" He froze, startled by the calm in her voice, then laughed awkwardly. "You're imagining things," he said, brushing past her. But Grace wasn't imagining anymore. She was finally seeing. She went to bed without another word, staring at the ceiling long after he fell asleep. Outside, Lagos buzzed as always, cars honking, music drifting from distant bars, but inside, everything was painfully still. Her thoughts moved slowly, deliberate as footsteps in sand. She knew something had ended, but she didn't yet know what would begin in its place. By mid-month, the cracks in their marriage had become chasms. Grace found herself growing quieter by the day, speaking only when necessary. The children sensed it too, their once lively chatter softening whenever their parents were in the same room. One evening, she found Maxine in the living room, typing furiously on his laptop, the glow of the screen painting his face blue. She stood behind him, unnoticed, long enough to see a woman's name appear in the chat window. Her heart didn't race this time. She didn't feel betrayal, she felt confirmation. When he finally looked up, startled by her presence, she smiled, a small, calm smile that made him uneasy. "Dinner's ready," she said, her tone smooth as silk. During the meal, he spoke about work, about traffic, about anything except the widening gap between them. Grace nodded at intervals, her face unreadable. Later, when he kissed her cheek goodnight, she felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, just emptiness. In that emptiness, something powerful began to grow, resolve. As she lay awake listening to the hum of the ceiling fan, she realized that silence was no longer her prison. It was her preparation. And though she didn't yet know how or when, she knew she would not remain a ghost in that house forever. The first light of dawn found her still awake, eyes open, staring into the ceiling, as if watching her own courage quietly take shape. Grace woke before the alarm that morning, heart thudding to an unfamiliar rhythm. The house was too quiet, as if even the walls were holding their breath. She dressed slowly, choosing a plain gown, the kind that drew no attention. Her mind replayed the message she had seen on Maxine's phone, the one that had sliced through the last thin layer of her denial. She had read it again after he slept, confirming every detail. The words were burned into her mind like ink on skin. "Thanks for the house, baby." Grace had always thought pain made noise, but this one didn't. It settled in silence, heavy and complete. She moved through the house that morning as though she were walking inside a memory. Every item she had once chosen with love now felt like a stranger. The sofa they bought together, the curtains she had begged him to help hang, the photo frame on the wall showing smiles that had already died. When Maxine came down for breakfast, he wore that same effortless confidence she had once admired. "Morning," he said, voice casual, face unreadable. She looked at him, and for the first time, saw not her husband but a man she had outgrown. He ate quickly, eyes fixed on his phone, and left without noticing her silence. When the door closed, she exhaled slowly. There was no need to cry anymore. The tears had served their purpose. Grace took out a notepad and began to write a list, not of chores, not of groceries, but of everything that was hers. She started with documents, moved to household items, then paused. Ownership was not just about property, it was about reclaiming herself. That morning, she decided she would never be a background character in her own life again. The following days blurred into one another, and Grace wore patience like perfume, invisible, constant, lingering. She smiled at Maxine when he came home, spoke softly to the children, and kept the house as spotless as ever. But beneath her calm, a quiet flame burned. Every night, when the house slept, she pulled out her laptop, researching property transfers, legal loopholes, and ownership rights. Lagos was full of stories like hers, women turned into shadows by love and loyalty. She refused to be one of them. One afternoon, she went to see Barrister Hallelujah, a discreet lawyer known for his efficiency and silence. His office sat above a noisy printing shop in Surrey, its paint peeling but its reputation intact. Grace waited as he read through the documents she had gathered, property deeds, land surveys, old receipts Maxine had left carelessly in drawers. "You're smart," the lawyer said finally, looking up. "Most women don't plan. They react." Grace met his gaze calmly. "I've done enough reacting," she said. "Now I act." They spent hours drafting letters and verifying signatures. She left his office with a plan hidden in her purse and a new kind of courage inside her chest. When she got home, she greeted Maxine warmly, listened to his jokes, and laughed at the right moments. He didn't notice anything had changed. Men like Maxine rarely did until it was too late. That night, she prayed, not for her marriage but for wisdom. Her voice was steady, her heart light. The woman who once wept for love now plotted for freedom, and it suited her. A week later, Maxine mentioned traveling to Abuja for a business trip. Grace nodded, smiling faintly. It was a lie. She knew he would be with the woman from the messages. But this time, she didn't confront him. She helped him pack, kissed his cheek, and waved from the doorway. When his car disappeared down the street, she went straight to Barrister Hallelujah's office. The lawyer had already set things in motion. By evening, papers were being processed, signatures verified, and ownership quietly shifting from Maxine's name to hers. The process took days, and Grace moved through them like a ghost, calm, deliberate, unbothered. She cooked, cleaned, prayed, and smiled. The children noticed her lightness and smiled back. For the first time in years, peace visited her heart, not because life had changed, but because she had. When Maxine returned from his trip, he brought gifts for the kids and a fake tired smile for her. "It was stressful," he said, rubbing his neck. She nodded, pretending to believe him. That night, while he showered, she walked to the window and looked out at the streetlights. The city pulsed below, restless and alive. Somewhere out there, the woman who had stolen her husband's affection was probably laughing. Grace didn't hate her. She pitied her. She knew now that nothing built on deceit ever lasted. And when the house papers were finally delivered to her a week later, she placed them in her wardrobe and whispered, "My freedom is mine." Days rolled into weeks, and life resumed its rhythm, but Grace's heart no longer carried the weight of waiting. She had her plan sealed and safe. She watched Maxine with the detachment of someone studying a stranger. He still played his games, still flirted with danger, still mistook silence for weakness. What he didn't know was that Grace's silence had teeth now. Every smile she gave was a secret, every glance a quiet victory. She spent her evenings journaling again, not about pain this time, but about purpose. She wrote of her dreams, of travel, of raising her children somewhere far from the noise of betrayal. The thought of leaving no longer scared her. It thrilled her. One evening, she stood in front of the mirror, wearing a simple blue dress. For the first time, she didn't see a wife or a victim. She saw a woman reborn from ashes. When Maxine came home that night and dropped his briefcase carelessly on the couch, she met his eyes and smiled. "How was your day?" she asked, voice gentle, calm. "Busy as always," he said, loosening his tie. Grace nodded, turned, and walked away, her step steady. Behind that calm exterior, plans were unfolding like quiet lightning. Nothing in the house had changed, yet everything had. The air itself felt charged with the weight of coming truth. Grace didn't know when or how the storm would break, but she was ready. For the first time in years, she was no longer afraid of what came next. Morning came like a whisper through half-drawn curtains, the kind of soft light that made Lagos look innocent before the day's noise began. Grace stood by the window, watching a pair of pigeons peck at crumbs on the balcony rail. The city stretched and yawned awake outside, buses coughing to life, voices rising from street vendors calling out their wares. Inside the house, everything looked perfect, the clean floors, the neatly arranged chairs, the photographs that lied with their smiles. Maxine was still asleep upstairs, sprawled across the bed as if the world owed him rest. Grace's face was calm, but her heart pulsed with something new, not fear, not doubt, but quiet resolve. The documents were ready, safely tucked away where no careless hand could find them. For the first time, she felt the weight of ownership, the thrill of control. She had turned every hurt into a weapon, and every tear into a plan. As she brewed tea, she thought of the day she would leave, not as a woman running away, but as one walking toward peace. When Maxine came downstairs, yawning, scratching his chin, she handed him his tea with the same gentleness as always. "You're quiet these days," he said. She smiled faintly. "Maybe I'm learning silence from you." He chuckled, thinking it was a joke, and sipped his tea. She watched him drink, her eyes steady. He didn't know he was drinking from the same cup she had once cried over. The irony made her smile again, a small, secret curve of the lips. The clock ticked in the background, marking the slow unraveling of a story that was no longer his to control. That afternoon, Grace drove to the lawyer's office one last time. The roads were crowded, yellow buses swerving like restless thoughts, hawkers knocking on car windows with bottles of water and roasted groundnuts. Lagos had its own kind of heartbeat, loud, impatient, relentless, but inside her car, Grace was a pool of still water. The documents were complete now, the signatures legal, the property hers. Barrister Hallelujah reviewed everything one final time, his pen scratching softly across the last page. "It's done," he said, handing her the folder. Grace looked down at the papers, her name written boldly where Maxine's used to be. Ownership, identity, freedom, all in one bundle of files. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're a brave woman," the lawyer said, and she smiled faintly. "No, just tired," she replied. As she left the office, the humid air wrapped around her like a heavy blanket, but she didn't mind. Each breath felt lighter than the last. Driving home, she rolled down the windows, letting the warm breeze brush her face. For years, she had moved through life quietly, invisible even in her own story. Now she existed again. When she reached home, the children ran to hug her, their laughter like bells chasing away the ghosts. Maxine wasn't home yet, no surprise there. Grace made dinner, humming to herself, her movements smooth and sure. Later, when he walked in, smelling of perfume that wasn't hers, she welcomed him with a smile. "How was work?" she asked. "Same old stress," he replied, loosening his tie. Grace nodded, turning back to her pot of stew. He didn't notice the flicker of triumph in her eyes or the quiet finality in her tone. She had learned to wear peace like armor. 2 days later, the sun rose golden and heavy, and Grace decided to act. She called a real estate agent recommended by the lawyer, a soft-spoken man named Cunnell with sharp eyes and steady hands. They met in a small cafe at Lekki, the air thick with the smell of coffee and distant sea breeze. Grace handed him the documents, speaking with calm precision. "I want it sold quietly," she said. "No publicity, no delay." Cunnell nodded, understanding without questions. Within a week, he found a buyer, a young entrepreneur who admired the house's architecture and paid in full. Grace watched as the transaction completed, her name signed for the last time on papers she no longer needed. The house that had once held her pain now belonged to someone else. She didn't feel loss, she felt release. When she returned home that evening, Maxine was in the living room, watching football with the children. "You look happy," he said casually. She smiled, sitting beside her daughter. "Maybe I am," she said, and he nodded without thought, eyes still glued to the screen. Grace looked around the room, the walls, the furniture, the memories, and felt a soft goodbye rising in her chest. The house was already sold, the payment sitting quietly in her account. She imagined telling Maxine, imagined his disbelief, but she decided against it. Truth was a luxury she no longer owed him. That night, she packed a small bag and hid it beneath the bed. Freedom had a taste, and it was close. The following morning, the air was thick with the smell of rain waiting to fall. Grace woke the children early, dressed them for school, and prepared breakfast as usual. Maxine was half asleep, scrolling through his phone. "You're up early," he murmured. "Yes," she said softly, tying her scarf. "There's a lot to do." When the children had eaten and their bags were packed, she walked them to the car, her heart calm, her face serene. She waved at Maxine from the driveway, her smile gentle, steady, final. He waved back, distracted, not knowing he was waving goodbye. After dropping the children at school, Grace didn't drive to her office. Instead, she took a different route, toward the lawyer's bank, where the payment from the house had cleared. She signed the final withdrawal forms and transferred the funds into an offshore account. By noon, she was on her way to the airport. Her hands trembled only once, when she turned off her phone. She didn't leave a note, just silence. When Maxine returned home later, expecting dinner and laughter, he found nothing but emptiness. The rooms echoed with his own voice, and when he tried to sit, the house itself seemed to mock him. He called her number, it was unreachable. He called the agent, the line didn't connect. It took hours before he found out the truth. The house had been sold legally, every document stamped and sealed. Grace was gone, and with her, everything he thought he owned. Somewhere high above the clouds, she looked out the plane window, Lagos fading beneath her like a bad dream. Her heart was quiet, her soul untangled. For the first time in years, she wasn't running from pain. She was walking toward peace, one silent mile at a time. The news of Grace's disappearance spread through Maxine's world like smoke after a fire, slow at first, then suffocating. The day she left, the sun had risen like any other, but by evening, the air in the house felt different, thinner, emptier. Her scent lingered faintly on the curtains, her laughter only a memory caught between the walls. Maxine moved through the rooms like a man searching for something he didn't know he'd lost. Her wardrobe stood half empty, her favorite mug missing, her perfume bottles gone. The children's laughter no longer echoed down the hallway. Their toys were gone too. He opened drawers, rifled through papers, searching for a clue, a note, a message, an explanation, but all he found was silence. Silence louder than shouting. It wasn't until he called his lawyer days later, seeking advice on a family misunderstanding, that truth hit him like a slap. The house was no longer his. The property had been sold. Legally. Every document was perfect, every signature authentic. His name was gone, replaced by hers in bold ink. "It's impossible," he whispered, his voice cracking. But it wasn't. The lawyer explained it patiently, showing him the dates, the seals, the stamps. Maxine's hand trembled as he reached for the papers, his eyes blurring as the reality set in. Grace had done it quietly, neatly, beautifully. He was living proof that arrogance blinds before it destroys. That night, he drank heavily, pouring whiskey into a glass he didn't remember lifting. The walls mocked him, the silence roared, and the realization settled like cold metal in his chest. The woman he thought he owned had outsmarted him without ever raising her voice. Days bled into nights, and Maxine's world began to unravel. His colleagues noticed the change first. The man who once strutted through the office now moved like a shadow, distracted and hollow-eyed. The confidence that once drew people to him had drained away, leaving behind a shell of what he used to be. Rumors started to whisper through the corridors, little sparks of gossip about his wife's sudden disappearance. Some said she had run away with another man. Others said she had lost her mind. Maxine didn't correct them. How could he? He couldn't even tell them that the house he had flaunted, the symbol of his success, was no longer his. The house he once used to entertain clients now belonged to strangers. He drove by one evening, unable to resist. From the gate, he could hear the laughter of new owners, a family that seemed whole. He watched through the half-open door as children played where his own used to, their voices mingling with the sound of a woman singing softly from the kitchen. The lights inside glowed warm and golden, mocking him. That sight broke something in him that pride could not repair. He sat in his car long after dark, the city buzzing around him, but he felt completely alone. For the first time, he saw himself clearly, not as the charming man with a good job and an easy smile, but as a fool who mistook devotion for weakness. Grace's face haunted him at night, not the angry one from their last years, but the gentle one from their beginning. The one who believed in him. The one he had betrayed. Grace, meanwhile, found herself in a new city where no one knew her name or her story. She rented a modest apartment in Port Harcourt, one overlooking the waterfront, where the air carried the scent of salt and the distant hum of ships. Each morning, she woke to the sound of seagulls and distant engines, a strange melody of freedom. She enrolled the children in a nearby school and started working remotely for an accounting firm. The rhythm of her new life was quiet but steady. There were no unexpected calls, no late-night arguments, no heavy silences that filled the air like fog. Sometimes she would stand by the window, watching rain fall into the sea, and think about the years she had given away. Regret visited her sometimes, but it never stayed long. It had nothing new to say. Grace spent her evenings cooking simple meals, helping the children with homework, and telling stories before bed. They laughed more now, even though they missed their father. She told them he was fine, that sometimes adults needed time apart to remember who they were. In truth, she no longer hated Maxine. Hatred was too heavy to carry across oceans. What she felt now was something softer, a calm understanding that not every love story is meant to last forever. Some are meant to teach, to bruise, to awaken. One evening, months after her move, Grace received a message from an unknown number. "I hope you're happy now." That was all it said. She stared at the screen for a long time, then typed a single reply. "I finally am." After sending it, she deleted the conversation and turned off her phone. Outside, the sea breeze carried the scent of rain, and she closed her eyes, breathing it in. The children were asleep, their small snores like music in the quiet apartment. She sat by the window with a cup of tea, her thoughts wandering but peaceful. Life had not given her the ending she expected, but it had given her a beginning she hadn't dared to imagine. In the distance, thunder rolled softly, a promise of rain. Grace smiled, a small, genuine curve of the lips. She thought of Lagos, of the house she had left behind, of the woman she had been, and she felt gratitude. Not for the pain, but for the strength it revealed. She was no longer the Grace who waited by the window for love that never came home. She was the Grace who walked away and found herself. And in that quiet room, as the first drops of rain tapped gently against the glass, she realized something profound. Freedom didn't roar, it whispered just like she did. The night air in Port Harcourt carried a soft drizzle, the kind that blurred streetlights and made the world feel distant, half asleep. Grace sat by the window with a notebook on her lap, her pen moving slowly across the page. She had begun journaling again, this time not to mourn or remember, but to build. Her handwriting flowed steadier now, her thoughts less tangled. The children were asleep, the small apartment humming with the quiet rhythm of peace. She could hear the rain tapping gently against the window pane, the distant sound of a ship's horn echoing from the harbor. This new life was not luxurious, but it was hers, built from ashes she had refused to choke on. Each day began with purpose, each night ended in calm. She no longer jumped when the phone rang, no longer watched the clock waiting for footsteps that came too late. The anxiety that once lived in her chest had turned into stillness. She still thought of Maxine sometimes. Memories came like the wind, unexpected but passing. She didn't try to block them anymore. They were part of her story, but they no longer defined it. In the quiet of that evening, she realized something she had never dared to say aloud. Peace was not found in forgiveness or revenge, but in finally choosing herself. She closed her notebook, leaned back in her chair, and whispered, "I made it." Across the miles, in Lagos, Maxine was learning how silence felt when it had no answer. The house he once called his own was now fully occupied by the new family. Sometimes he drove past it at night, parking across the street, just to see the lights glowing inside, trying to imagine his children running through those halls. His job had grown heavier, his laughter thinner, his reflection unfamiliar. He had bought a smaller apartment in Acadia, a place that felt more like a hotel room than a home. Bottles lined his kitchen counter, the echo of his loneliness filling every empty space. He scrolled through old photos on his phone. Grace's smile, the children's birthdays, holidays that once seemed ordinary but now felt like gold. He tried calling her again once, though he knew the number was gone. The network replied with the same calm indifference every time. "The number you have dialed is not available." He laughed bitterly at that message, a laugh that turned into something broken halfway through. For the first time, he understood what Grace had felt all those years, the cold weight of being unseen. His side affairs had vanished, replaced by indifference. Even the woman who once boasted about their house had long moved on to another man with deeper pockets. Life had a cruel symmetry. It always returned what you gave it, though not when you expected. Maxine, the man who once had everything, was now surrounded by nothing but the echo of his own mistakes. Months turned into a year, and the distance between them became a rhythm neither of them tried to break. Grace's life blossomed quietly in her new city. Her children were thriving. Her son joined a football club, her daughter loved the piano. Grace attended parent meetings, smiled at teachers, and even laughed with other mothers over cups of tea. The past had become a shadow that followed her, but no longer frightened her. One Sunday, she took the children to the waterfront, watching them run along the edge of the sand, chasing the foam as waves broke and rolled back. She thought about everything she had survived, the betrayal, the loneliness, the slow death of a love she once believed in. It all seemed so far away now, like another lifetime. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, the salty air filling her lungs, the laughter of her children stitching something whole inside her. She no longer needed closure from Maxine. The closure had been in the act of walking away, of choosing life over fear. That evening, she cooked their favorite meal and told them stories about courage, about how storms never last forever. Her daughter asked, "Mummy, are we happy now?" Grace smiled, pulling her close. "Yes," she said softly, "we are happy now." The words felt real, and for the first time in years, she truly believed them. Maxine heard about them by accident. A mutual friend mentioned that Grace and the children were doing well, that she looked healthier, lighter, freer. He nodded when he heard it, pretending not to care, but later that night, he sat on his balcony, staring at the city lights, the bottle untouched beside him. The truth was a heavy companion. He had lost not just a wife, but the only person who had ever seen him beyond his charm. He thought of calling her again, to say sorry, to ask how she was, but he knew that some distances were sacred, some silences too pure to break. So he whispered his apology into the night, knowing it would never reach her. In another city, at almost the same hour, Grace stood by her window, watching the same stars. She didn't know he was thinking of her, didn't need to. She had her peace, and that was enough. The wind moved softly through the curtains, carrying the scent of rain, and she closed her eyes, feeling a strange kind of grace wash over her. The past was gone, the pain was gone, but the lessons remained, etched in her heart like quiet scripture. She turned away from the window, switched off the light, and lay beside her sleeping children. Outside, the rain began again, falling gentle and endless, like forgiveness itself. Dear listener, when love begins to hurt more than it heals, learn to pause and listen to yourself. Never lose your voice trying to keep someone who enjoys your silence. Sometimes walking away is not weakness, it's wisdom wearing calm. Protect your peace the way you'd protect your breath, because peace is the one thing no one should steal from you. You deserve love that speaks softly, stands firmly, and never makes you doubt your worth. Heavenly Father, for everyone listening right now, we ask for healing where hearts have been broken, for peace where storms have lived too long. May you give them strength to let go of what no longer serves them, courage to rebuild, and wisdom to choose peace over pain. For every tear they have shed in silence, let laughter return like morning light. May their homes know calm, may their hands find purpose, and may love find them pure and true this time. In every season, let their joy overflow and their stories end in grace. And if you believe this, say aloud and joyful, Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.